I still remember the day I made the decision. Adoption had always been in the back of my mind, a quiet longing tucked between the pages of my life. I had spent years watching my friends settle down, build families, fall in and out of love. But for me, love had always been a fleeting thing, never quite enough to anchor me to another person. Yet I wanted a child. Not just to fill a void, not to meet some societal expectation, but because I knew, deep in my bones, I had more love to give than I could ever contain within myself. It wasn't an easy decision. I agonized over it for months, questioned whether I could truly do it alone. But when I first saw him, 3 years old with solemn eyes too big for his small face, I knew. There was no hesitation, no second-guessing. He was mine. Now 16 years later he is 19 and I am 45. Somehow, the years have passed in a blur of scraped knees, bedtime stories, school recitals, and quiet moments in between. He is taller than me now, stronger. He plays rugby, a sport that always leaves me holding my breath on the sidelines, cheering through my worry. And I am still me. A teacher, a woman who prefers quiet mornings with coffee, and someone who has built her life around the bond we share. We have a rhythm, he and I. During the week, I'm the strict, responsible one, making sure he wakes up on time, eats properly, and doesn't slack off in his studies. But on weekends we have our own little tradition, the bathhouse. It started when he was a boy, just a small ritual to chase away the winter cold. But over time it became something sacred. A place where we could simply exist, away from the noise of the world. This Saturday, like every Saturday, we pack our things and head out just as the sun begins to dip below the horizon. The bathhouse is quiet when we arrive, the warm scent of cedar and steam greeting us like an old friend. He walks beside me, his movements easy and familiar, his voice carrying the deep timbre of someone still adjusting to adulthood. "You're going to fall asleep in there again," he teases as we step inside. Smirk. "And you're going to scold me for it, just like always." It's a game we've played for years. Inside, we settle into one of the smaller, private steam rooms. The heat wraps around us, melting away the exhaustion of the week. He leans back against the wooden wall, closing his eyes for a moment. "How was work?" he asks. "Long," I admit, exhaling slowly. "A student called me ancient today. I think I need to start lying about my age." He snorts. "They have no idea what they're talking about." I glance at him, amused. "Oh, and what would you call me then?" His eyes open, meeting mine with an expression I can't quite read. "You're just you." There is something about the way he says it that makes me pause. I study him, this boy. Know this man, who has been by my side for so many years. His features are familiar yet different now, more defined, his jawline sharp, his expression thoughtful. I see glimpses of the child he used to be in the way his fingers drum idly against his knee, in the way he still hums when he's deep in thought. But he is not a child anymore. For a moment, the silence between us stretches, thick with something unspoken. He looks away first, shifting slightly as if suddenly aware of the stillness. "You should drink some water. You always get light-headed when you stay in too long." I smile at his concern. Yes, my wise and all-knowing son." He rolls his eyes but doesn't argue. After a while, we move to the cold plunge, an abrupt but exhilarating contrast. I shiver as I step in, and he laughs at my reaction, the sound warm and familiar. Moments like this remind me why I chose this path all those years ago. I may not have a husband, and I may have raised him alone, but I have never felt alone. 'Cause I have him. And in the quiet, in the warmth of the bathhouse, in the way he glances at me when he thinks I'm not looking, I know. We are a family. And that is enough. I don't know when it started. Maybe I was too busy with work, with keeping up our home, with making sure he had everything he needed to step into adulthood. Or maybe it was so gradual that I never noticed, like the slow shifting of seasons until one day you wake up and realize winter has melted into spring. But Andrew had changed. Started subtly. Compliments, small at first, spoken so casually that I barely registered them. "Mom, you always smell nice," he'd say as we sat in the car driving to the store. Or, "You should wear that color more often. It makes your eyes stand out." I would laugh, brushing it off, assuming it was just him growing into the confident young man I had raised. He had always been thoughtful, always looking out for me. But then there were other things. The way his presence had shifted, how he carried himself. Broader shoulders, a stronger frame, the kind of quiet confidence that comes with knowing one's own strength. He had turned into a real man. At 19, he had surpassed me in height, in strength, in presence. His deep voice filled the house in a way that had once belonged to his childish laughter. His once boyish hands, which had clutched mine so tightly when he was little, were now rougher, larger, more assured when he placed them on my shoulder in passing or when he took the grocery bags from my hands with ease. And he had become protective in ways he never was before. One evening, after our usual Bathhouse visit, I stopped by the grocery store to pick up a few things. Andrew walked beside me, pushing the cart as I grabbed items off the shelves. I had always been the independent type, never needing anyone to hover around me, but lately, I had begun to notice the way Andrew watched people. It happened when we were checking out. A man in line behind me, slightly too close for comfort, leaned in and said, "Excuse me, miss." Before I could even turn, Andrew had already stepped forward, his tall frame blocking me from view. His shoulders squared, his voice even but firm. "Can I help you with something?" The man, taken aback, shook his head and mumbled an apology before stepping back. I hadn't even realized how tense I had been until I exhaled, glancing up at Andrew. His jaw was tight. His hands curled slightly into fists. "Andrew," I murmured, placing a hand on his arm. "It's fine." He looked down at me, and for a moment I saw something flicker in his gaze. Something unreadable, something unfamiliar. "Yeah," he finally said, his voice softer. "I just don't like people getting too close to you." His words lingered in my mind for the rest of the night. The following weekend, our routine continued as it always did. The bathhouse was empty when we arrived, the steam curling in the dim light. I sighed as I stepped into the warm water, letting the heat wrap around my tired muscles. Andrew followed, settling in beside me, his large frame taking up more space than it used to. For a while we sat in silence, listening to the gentle hiss of the steam. "You've been quiet," he finally said. I glanced at him, the way the water clung to his skin, the way his hair dripped down onto his shoulders. "Just thinking," I admitted. "About what?" He hesitated. "About how much you've changed." A slow smirk tugged at his lips. "For the better, I hope." I let out a soft laugh. "Of course." He exhaled, leaning back against the wooden edge of the tub. "You know, I've been thinking about that too. How different things are now." I studied him, the way his fingers traced absent patterns in the water. "You don't have to worry about me the way you used to," he said. "I mean, I know you still see me as the little boy you raised, but I want you to see me for who I am now." His words sent a strange shiver down my spine, but I smiled, reaching out to squeeze his hand. "I do see you," I said softly. "You're strong, Andrew. You've grown into someone I'm proud of." His grip tightened slightly around my fingers, his gaze steady. "Good," he murmured. The warmth of the bathhouse surrounded us, the quiet pressing in, but for the first time in a long while, I felt something shift, something unspoken, something I wasn't sure how to name. In the days that followed, I became more aware of Andrew than I had before. The way he watched me not just with the eyes of a son, but with something deeper, something more knowing. The way he lingered after conversations, the way his presence filled the space between us in a way that felt different. One evening, as I stood on a stool trying to reach the top shelf in the kitchen, I suddenly felt hands on my waist, lifting me easily. "Careful," Andrew murmured, his breath close to my ear. I let out a surprised laugh as he set me down. "You could have just grabbed it for me, you know." "I like being useful," he said, his voice low. There was something in the way he said it that made me pause, my heart doing an odd little flutter. And then he smiled, just a small, knowing curve of his lips before stepping away. And for the first time, I realized something I hadn't before. Andrew wasn't just growing up. He was growing into something else entirely. Something I wasn't sure I was ready to face. The evening had settled into a quiet hum, the house wrapped in the kind of stillness that only comes after a long day. I had just finished cleaning up in the kitchen, rubbing at the knot in my neck that had been bothering me for days. I hadn't realized how tense I had been lately, how the weight of work and life had begun to settle into my bones. Andrew noticed. He always did. "You look like you're in pain," he said casually from the living room, glancing up from his phone as I walked in. I sighed, rolling my shoulders. "Just a little stiff. I think I slept wrong." He studied me for a moment, then set his phone aside and stretched his arms over his head, the movement effortless and fluid. "Come here," he said simply. I frowned, pausing mid-step. "What for?" He smirked, tilting his head toward the couch. "Just sit. I'll help." I hesitated, not because I didn't trust him, but because something about the offer made my breath catch. Still, the ache in my muscles won over, and I walked over, settling on the couch in front of him. He moved behind me, his large hands resting lightly on my shoulders. Even through my shirt, his touch was warm, steady. "Tell me if it hurts," he murmured. I nodded, closing my eyes as his thumbs pressed gently into the tight muscles at the base of my neck. At first it was just a soft pressure, almost tentative, as if he was testing how much I could handle. But as I exhaled, relaxing under his touch, he grew more confident, his fingers kneading slow, careful circles into my skin. "You carry so much tension here," he said, his voice low. I let out a quiet hum of agreement, too focused on the way his hands moved to form words. He worked with a patience I hadn't expected, fingers sliding up to my scalp, tracing the curve of my skull before pressing lightly against the points where the tension was the worst. The sensation sent a shiver down my spine, not of discomfort, but of something else entirely. "That feels nice," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. He chuckled softly. "Good." His fingers threaded through my hair, massaging in slow, rhythmic strokes that made it impossible to hold on to any lingering stress. My head grew heavy, tilting forward slightly, and I realized just how much I had needed this. "You're really good at this," I murmured, half lost in the soothing motion. His hands stilled for a second, as if my words had caught him off guard, but then he resumed, his touch even gentler this time. "I just want you to relax." There was something in his voice, something I couldn't quite place. It was softer than usual, more careful. I wanted to turn and look at him to see the expression on his face, but I stayed still, unwilling to break the moment. His hands slid back down to my shoulders, kneading slow circles over my upper back. He was strong, stronger than I sometimes remembered, and yet he was careful, like he knew exactly how much pressure to use. I felt the last remnants of tension melt away under his touch, my body growing warm and heavy. For a long time neither of us spoke. The room was quiet, save for the faint sound of the clock ticking on the wall. His fingers lingered, tracing light patterns against my skin. It wasn't just a massage anymore. It had turned into something else, something unspoken but present in the space between us. I should have moved, should have said something to break the quiet, but I didn't. Instead, I let myself lean back slightly, just enough to feel the warmth of him behind me. He didn't pull away. His hands slowed, his touch almost hesitant now. And then, in a voice so low it was barely more than a whisper, he asked, "Does it still hurt?" I swallowed, my pulse quickening just slightly. "No, it doesn't." I wasn't sure if we were still talking about the tension in my muscles. For the first time since he started, I turned my head slightly, just enough to catch a glimpse of him from the corner of my eye. He was already looking at me, his expression unreadable, his eyes darker than usual. For a moment, neither of us moved. The silence stretched between us, heavy with something we weren't ready to name. And then, just as I opened my mouth to speak, he slowly, almost reluctantly, drew his hands away. "Good," he said, his voice steady, but there was something underneath it, something I wasn't sure I was ready to face. I sat there for a moment, gathering my thoughts, before offering a small smile. "Thank you, Andrew. That really helped." His lips quirked into a smirk, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Anytime." And somehow I knew he meant it. The weekend arrived again, and as always, we prepared for our trip to the bathhouse. But something felt different this time. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but there was a subtle shift in the air, an undercurrent of anticipation that hadn't been there before. Maybe it was my own mind playing tricks on me, or maybe it was Andrew. His growing confidence, the way he carried himself lately, the way his voice had taken on a deeper, steadier tone that made him seem older than his 19 years. I found myself stealing glances at him as we packed our things. He moved with an ease that hadn't always been there, his broad shoulders filling out the simple black t-shirt he wore, his hands quick and sure as he gathered towels and bottled water. He caught me looking once, and instead of the usual playful smirk, he just held my gaze for a moment before giving me a small nod, as if reassuring me of something unspoken. We drove in comfortable silence, the hum of the car and the faint rhythm of the rain tapping against the windshield filling the space between us. I felt strangely restless, my fingers tapping idly against my knee as I stared out the window. "You okay?" Andrew's voice was low, steady, pulling me back to the moment. I turned to him, forcing a small smile. "Yeah, just tired, I guess." He studied me for a second before nodding. "It's been a long week." The bathhouse was nearly empty when we arrived, the late evening keeping most people away. It was one of the things I loved about our visits, the quiet, the solitude, the way the warm steam seemed to wrap around us like a cocoon, shutting out the rest of the world. Inside, I let out a soft sigh as the heat began to work its magic, easing the tension in my muscles. But Andrew, as always, noticed things I didn't even say out loud. "Your neck's still bothering you," he murmured. I reached up instinctively, rubbing at the sore spot. "Yeah, I guess I've just been holding a lot of stress lately." He moved closer, settling behind me. "Let me help." There was no hesitation this time, no playful teasing like before, just quiet certainty. I let out a slow breath and nodded. "All right." His hands found my shoulders, warm and firm but gentle, kneading slow circles into the tight muscles at the base of my neck. I closed my eyes, letting myself sink into the sensation. His fingers worked with a kind of patience I hadn't expected, pressing just enough to ease the tension but never enough to hurt. "You always take care of everyone else," he murmured after a while. "You never let anyone take care of you." I opened my eyes slightly, surprised by the softness in his tone. "I guess that's just how I am." His fingers stilled for a second before resuming. "I just want you to know, see it, everything you've done for me, everything you've given up. And I'm grateful." A lump formed in my throat. "Andrew." "I mean it," he said, his voice steady. "You didn't have to choose me, but you did. You gave me a life, a home. You made sure I never felt alone." I swallowed past the sudden wave of emotion, my heart tightening at his words. "You were never a choice, Andrew. You were always meant to be mine." For a moment, there was only silence between us, thick with something I wasn't sure how to name. His hands slowed, fingers barely brushing against my skin now, as if he was memorizing the shape of me. I turned my head slightly, just enough to look at him, and for the first time I realized just how close we were. His eyes met mine, searching, questioning. There was something different there, something I wasn't sure I was ready to face. And then, as if drawn by some unseen force, he leaned in. It was the barest brush of lips, hesitant, uncertain, lingering in the space between a question and an answer. My breath caught. The world seemed to hold still for one fragile second. And then, just as quickly, we pulled away. Neither of us spoke. The steam curled around us, the heat pressing in, but all I could feel was the steady hammering of my heart against my ribs. Andrew exhaled softly, his gaze never leaving mine. But I shook my head, not because I was upset, but because I didn't know what to say. "Let's go home," I murmured. He nodded once, and without another word, we gathered our things and stepped out into the cool night air. The drive home was quiet, filled with thoughts neither of us voiced. Something had changed, and there was no going back.